On December 7th, 1987, PSA Flight 1771 had just taken off from LA International Airport, Terminal 1. 15 minutes later, as the control tower was communicating with the pilot, they heard a couple of gunshots.
That was a gun. Squawk 77, we've had a gun fired on board the aircraft.
A few seconds later, one of the flight attendants rushed to the cockpit and urgently said to the pilot,
"We have a problem."
But after that, immediately, they heard a man saying,
I am the problem.
and another shot which hit the flight attendant in the head, killing her on the spot. At these moments, panic was taken over whoever is still alive from the 43 passengers on board. At the same time, the pilot and the first officer on this flight were facing a dangerous and armed man who could do anything to them at this point. The last thing that was heard was additional gunshots, in addition to background noises of chaos followed by eerie silence. So who's that man? And was he targeting someone on that plane, or did he have other motives for all that violence? But the most important question, what was the fate of the pilots and the passengers on board? On this fateful day, December 7th, 1987, passengers were going through a security check to board PSA Flight 1771, which stands for Pacific Southwest Airlines. At the same time, a man named David Burke was going to board the same flight, but he did not go through security screening. Instead, he was able to bypass normal security, going through another area using a PSA ID badge used by employees. However, this should not have happened in the first place, because several hours earlier, in the morning of that day, David Burke was fired from his job. He had been caught stealing money from the airline cocktail sales. He pleaded for leniency to his supervisor, Raymond Thompson. Instead, Raymond said that the decision was final. You see, David had a bit of a rocky life and a criminal history. He was not married, but had 7 kids from 4 different women. David insisted that he needed a job to support his family due to financial struggles, but Raymond refused to reinstate him. And before he left, David said to Raymond,
"I'll be seeing you."
However, Raymond did not think about that comment too much. This was actually a hint for the storm that is about to take place. In hindsight, he should have taken that comment seriously. Everyone in PSA Airlines knew that Raymond always takes a PSA flight back home every day, and David Burke knew that too. So he bought a ticket for the same flight that Raymond was gonna take. At the time, airline employees, including mechanics, flight attendants, and ticket agents, were often allowed to use employee boarding privileges to enter through secure areas without going through passenger security screening. This allowed David to smuggle a gun and bypass the standard security of the airport. As he entered the airplane, David headed straight to his seat and watched Raymond Thompson carefully from his spot. 15 minutes later, at approximately 22,000 feet, David got up from his seat and went to the seat of Raymond. He gave him a handwritten note and headed to the bathroom. The note said,
"Hi, Ray. I think it's sort of ironic that we ended up like this. I asked for some leniency for my family. Remember? Well, I got none, and you'll get none."
Inside the bathroom, David took out his gun and loaded it, fueled with anger and driven by revenge. He then walked towards Raymond and aimed his gun, shooting him in the back of the head, point blank, killing him instantly. The pilots, the cabin crew, and even the air traffic controllers all heard the gunshots. Immediately, panic ensued inside the plane. However, no one could stand up and do something, as the man was armed with a powerful and a deadly Magnum 44 caliber. But one of the flight attendants rushed towards the cockpit to inform the pilots about the situation. She knocked hard on the door repeatedly, then barged in and shouted,
"We have a problem."
David shot her in the head as well, and walked inside and said,
I am the problem.
The air traffic controller was asking the pilots and checking if they are alright, but 2 additional gunshots were heard from their side. David did not give the pilots much time to think or react to the situation, as he shot them both immediately. The air traffic controller kept listening and trying to get in contact, but there was no response from the pilots. All he heard was the sound of the cockpit door opening and closing, and an increase of windscreen noise. It seemed like the airplane was accelerating, and a minute later, another gunshot was heard. After that, they didn't hear any additional sounds other than the wind. After killing the pilot, Greg Lindemuth, and his co-pilot James Nunn, David Burke pushed the control yoke forward, sending the plane into a steep, high-speed nosedive. The airplane was accelerating downward with an incredible speed. It even broke the sound barrier. It is speculated that David messed around with the plane and changed its trajectory and speed, or the dead pilot was slumped against the control column, pushing the airplane to a nosedive at full speed, plummeting headfirst into the ground. However, one of the passengers wasn't going down without a fight. In fact, it wasn't any passenger. It was Captain Thomas C. Connolly, a PSA captain who was traveling as a passenger. Captain Connolly tried to leave his seat to save the plane from crashing. However, David shot him too, as he was struggling to get to the cockpit. At 4:16 p.m., all contact was lost because the plane crashed. They sent teams to track down its path, and they found the crash site. The airplane was in a hillside on the Santa Rita Cattle Ranch in the Santa Lucia Mountains.
There was no tail section, there were no aircraft seats, there was just papers everywhere, and the strong smell of aviation fuel.
The plane was estimated to have crashed at the speed of around 770 miles per hour, or 1240 kilometers per hour, disintegrating instantly after hitting a rocky hillside. The impact was so severe, it left a great damage to the point that only 16 out of 43 passengers were ever identified. The FBI had a hard time investigating the crash site. Very little in terms of evidence was ever found, and the only lead they had was the fact that someone used a gun inside the airplane. Fortunately, they found the black box of the airplane, which had the vocal records of the incident. They analyzed it, and from the gunshot sound, they deducted it came from a Magnum 44 caliber. Back at the crash site, they searched extensively for the weapon. First, they only found the remains of the notebook, which Burke slipped to Thompson, as well as the barrel of the gun, because the impact was so severe, even the gun broke apart. The other part that contains the gun handle and the trigger was found elsewhere at the site, and around the trigger there was a good bit of skin, which was taken immediately to study it. And there, they found out it was from the index finger of the person that was holding it. Upon further analysis, and comparing the passenger's recorded fingerprints, the prints on the skin matched perfectly with the registered index prints of David Burke. The FBI questioned Burke's girlfriend, and according to her, he was rather violent and abusive. They managed to get his voice recordings from the phone's answering machine, and his voice matched the one heard from the airplane black box, and this helped them connect the dots alongside other information they had found, like David Burke being fired by Ray Thompson, and the note finally making sense, thus confirming for the FBI that David was the perpetrator and revenge was his motivation. But whether there were other motives behind him crashing the plane and taking away the lives of all the passengers still remains unknown and a subject of speculation. This tragedy was done by one man that cost PSA an aircraft as well as the lives of 42 people. This put a huge dent in their reputation, causing clients to lose trust in that airline company due to the lack of proper security when they allowed David Burke to pass through without proper search for dangerous objects. The case was closed after confirming that Burke himself was the hijacker, and it led to major changes in airport security in the US, particularly stricter employee screenings and firearm regulations. Most importantly, airports began closely monitoring terminated employees to prevent similar revenge-based attacks and to avoid disasters like this.